I'm a mom, I'm a wife, I'm living my life. It was so lovely. But I'm just gonna say this, 10 years in, this made sense for my family. And not only that, but I just feel like it's just...
She was standing at the very top of Hollywood, earning more than almost any other actress over 40, with a career that stretched back 2 decades and a fan base that spanned several generations. And then, almost overnight, she vanished. No farewell tour. No tearful press conference. No dramatic announcement timed to a magazine cover. Cameron Diaz simply stopped showing up. For nearly a decade, the silence around her disappearance was filled with guesswork. Some assumed Hollywood had quietly pushed her out the way it does so many women once they pass a certain age. Others figured she had simply burned out after 20 relentless years in front of the camera. But the real explanation, once Diaz finally started talking about it publicly, turned out to be something far more personal, far more deliberate, and honestly, far more interesting than anything the tabloids had guessed. Today we are going to walk through exactly what happened, in her own timeline, using her own words from the interviews where she actually addressed it. Cameron Diaz was born in San Diego in August of 1972, and there was nothing in her upbringing that suggested a future in front of cameras. She came from a working-class family, went to public school, and got into modeling as a teenager mainly as a way to earn money, not because she was chasing fame. The modeling jobs took her to different countries while she was still a teenager, but acting was not part of the plan. That changed almost by accident in 1994, when she tried out for the female lead in a Jim Carrey comedy called The Mask. She had never acted professionally before that audition. She got the part anyway, and the film turned into a massive box office hit, instantly turning a 21-year-old model into a recognizable face in theaters across the country. From there, her career moved at a pace most actors never experience. She held her own alongside Julia Roberts in My Best Friend's Wedding in 1997. A year later, There's Something About Mary turned her into one of the most bankable comedic stars in the business and brought her a Golden Globe nomination. In 1999, she pushed in a completely different direction with being John Malkovich, proving she could handle strange, layered material that most comedic actors would never attempt, earning a second Golden Globe nomination the same year she appeared in Oliver Stone's football drama Any Given Sunday. By the early 2000s she was leading the Charlie's Angels franchise and voicing Princess Fiona in Shrek, a role that introduced her to an entirely new generation of fans who had no idea she'd already built an entire career before that. On paper, everything about her trajectory looked unstoppable. Behind the scenes, something else was quietly taking shape, something that had actually started long before any of this fame existed. Long before the magazine covers and movie premieres, Cameron Diaz was dealing with a problem that most fans never connected to anything she did later in life. As a teenager, she struggled with severe cystic acne, and in her own wellness book, The Body Book, she wrote candidly about how poor her diet was during those years, joking that if a person really is what they eat, she was basically made of greasy fast food. She called the acne embarrassing in more than one interview over the years, which is a striking thing to hear from someone who would eventually become known partly for her looks. That experience left a real mark on how she thought about food, health, and her own body for years afterward. Eventually she changed her entire diet, cutting out the fast food that had defined her eating habits as a teenager, and the difference she felt went well beyond clearer skin. She became genuinely interested in nutrition and fitness long before wellness culture became something every other celebrity in Hollywood would eventually adopt as a brand. That early interest never really went away. Diaz has also spoken publicly over the years about ongoing skin sensitivity, including issues with psoriasis that have been documented by dermatology outlets at different points in her career. What very few people noticed at the time was that she was quietly building a second identity underneath the movie star exterior, someone who genuinely cared about how the body works and what it needs, long before that became relevant to her career decisions. While that wellness interest kept developing in the background, the pressures of being one of the top actresses in the world were piling up. In 2013, The Hollywood Reporter named her the highest-paid female actor over the age of 40 working in the industry at that time, which by any conventional measure put her at the absolute peak of professional success. But when she later described what that peak actually felt like from the inside, the picture was far less glamorous than the headlines suggested. In a conversation with her friend Gwyneth Paltrow on Paltrow's Wellness series, Diaz explained that being the one delivering the performance meant nearly everything else in her life had to be handed off to other people, her schedule, her time, her daily decisions, because the job required total focus on a single thing. She described what filming a movie actually involves in blunt terms, pointing out that production effectively owns the actor, with 12-hour days stretching on for months at a time and almost no room left over for a normal personal life. She went on to say that actors are essentially infantilized by the system, treated almost like children who are simply told where to go and what to do, since everything else is managed for them. That kind of description is striking coming from someone who was, on paper, one of the most powerful actresses working at the time, and it points to something a lot of fans never really consider, which is that fame and box office power don't automatically come with personal control. Quite often, it works the other way around. The bigger the career, the less room there is left for an ordinary life. In that same conversation, Diaz explained that around the time she turned 40, she came to realize just how many parts of her own life had gone completely unmanaged, not because she didn't care about them, but because there was simply nothing left after giving everything to her career. She described handing off pieces of her life to other people and eventually having to take all of that responsibility back herself. That kind of realization, hitting at the height of professional success rather than during some career slump, is part of what makes her story different from the usual Hollywood retirement narrative. That breaking point eventually led to a decision that very few people at her level of fame are ever willing to make voluntarily. In 2014, Diaz appeared in the movie musical Annie playing Miss Hannigan, and at the time, nobody had any idea it would end up being her final film role for an entire decade. The shift away from acting did not happen with any dramatic announcement. She simply stopped accepting new roles, and public appearances slowly became rarer. It took years before she gave a clear, direct explanation in public for what had actually happened. By 2018, she had confirmed in interviews that she had stepped away from acting, describing the decision in terms of wanting to take a real, honest look at her whole life and figure out what she could improve, rather than continuing to exist only as the person everyone depended on professionally. In the conversation with Paltrow, she put it even more plainly, explaining that she had simply decided she wanted different things out of her life after going so hard for so long that there was no real space left for her personal relationships with family and friends. Once that decision was made, she said no outside opinion or offer could have changed her mind. That kind of certainty is rare in an industry that runs almost entirely on validation, awards, and constant public approval. Diaz was essentially saying that none of that mattered enough to keep her locked into a career that had taken over every part of her existence. This was not a story about someone fleeing failure or getting pushed out by an industry that had lost interest in her. This was someone walking away from enormous ongoing success because the personal cost of staying had become too high to justify continuing, and what she built immediately afterward shows exactly why that decision made sense for her. After stepping back from acting, Cameron Diaz did not vanish into total isolation. She redirected her energy into a completely different kind of life, one she had quietly been preparing for without most people realizing it. In January of 2015, she married Benji Madden, the former frontman of the band Good Charlotte, in a small, private ceremony that was deliberately kept away from the kind of large-scale spectacle that typically surrounds a wedding at her level of fame. According to her own account, the relationship moved quickly because both of them recognized early on that they were ready for that kind of commitment. In January of 2020, the couple welcomed their daughter, Radix. Diaz has described early motherhood as one of the most fulfilling stretches of her entire life, saying in interviews that for a significant part of that first year, nearly all of her energy was finally going somewhere that felt meaningful and lasting. That same year, she launched a wine brand called Avaline alongside business partner Catherine Power, built specifically around clean, low-intervention wine. The connection to her own personal history here is hard to miss. This was the same wellness philosophy she had been developing since her teenage years, when changing her diet to deal with acne first sparked a genuine interest in nutrition. Avaline grew into a real retail success, sold both online and in stores, built entirely on the idea that what people consume should be simple and free of unnecessary additives. This detail matters more than most retrospectives on her career tend to acknowledge. She wasn't randomly starting a wine company the way some retired celebrities pick up a passion project. She was building a business rooted in the exact health philosophy she had been quietly developing for over 20 years, long before she ever stepped away from acting in the first place. The wellness interest that started with teenage skin problems eventually grew into published wellness writing through her 2013 book The Body Book, and later The Longevity Book, before maturing further into an actual business built on the same values. Acting had been the job that paid the bills and built her name. Wellness had quietly been the deeper personal interest running underneath all of it the entire time. Once she finally had the time and the freedom, she was able to focus fully on the thing she had genuinely cared about all along, rather than the thing the industry had built around her. That same focus on personal well-being also explains something most coverage of her story has gotten wrong for years. For a long time, her departure from acting was treated as a simple, generic retirement story. A successful actress steps away from Hollywood, chooses a quieter life, and moves on, end of story. But that framing leaves out a much bigger part of what actually happened. The real story is not about an actress who suddenly quit on a whim. It's about an interest that had been quietly growing in the background for more than 2 decades. Long before she left Hollywood, Diaz was already deeply invested in questions about health and how the body works, something that began as a teenager trying to fix her skin and grew into a defining part of her identity. While she was building one of the biggest film careers of her generation, she was also developing a second identity centered entirely on wellness, one that had nothing to do with cameras or scripts. By the time she wrote her first health-focused book years before stepping away from acting, it was already clear that this new direction was not some sudden impulse but something she had been building toward for a long time. She was already thinking and acting like a wellness entrepreneur long before she ever stepped away from movie sets for good. Acting did not get replaced by nothing once she left it behind. It got replaced by something she had already been quietly building for 2 decades. The wine brand was not a random new hobby picked up out of boredom. It was the natural next chapter of an identity that had existed underneath the movie star persona the entire time, simply waiting for the schedule and the energy to make room for it. This helps explain why Diaz has consistently said in interviews that she doesn't miss performing, while never once expressing bitterness toward the industry that made her famous. She wasn't running away from something she hated. She was finally arriving somewhere she had been quietly heading toward for years, a place that had everything to do with managing her own body, her own time, and her own daily choices, and nothing to do with the demands of a film set. It also helps explain her eventual return to acting. In 2024, Diaz agreed to star opposite Jamie Foxx in the Netflix film Back in Action, a decision she has said was encouraged partly by conversations involving Foxx and football legend Tom Brady, who jokingly referred to himself as something of an expert on coming out of retirement. Diaz has credited her husband Benji Madden with encouraging her to take the leap as well, describing herself as both nervous and genuinely excited to step in front of a camera again after roughly a decade away. That comeback was never a sign that her retirement had somehow failed or that she missed the industry more than she let on. It was simply evidence that she now had enough personal balance and security to choose acting again entirely on her own terms, rather than feeling owned by the job the way she once described feeling during her original run. That distinction, choosing something versus being owned by it, sits at the center of nearly everything Cameron Diaz has said about her career since 2014, and it goes a long way toward explaining why she has never sounded resentful about the business that made her a household name in the first place. She built one of the most successful film careers of her generation and then walked away at the absolute peak of that success, which is something almost nobody at that level of fame ever chooses to do voluntarily. Most actors hold on for as long as the industry will have them, chasing one more role or one more paycheck. Diaz did the opposite while she was still very much in demand, and her own explanation across multiple interviews has stayed remarkably consistent over the years. The fame had become overwhelming. The schedule consumed nearly every part of her life. Other people were managing pieces of her existence that she genuinely wanted to manage herself. By the time she turned 40, large sections of her personal life had been quietly neglected for the better part of 2 decades. Rather than accepting all of that as simply the unavoidable cost of success, she made the relatively unusual choice to step away and rebuild her life around health, family, and a business rooted in something she actually cared about, instead of continuing to operate inside an identity the industry had built for her. The skin struggles of her teenage years, something most fans probably never think about at all when they picture her career, end up being one of the more important keys to understanding everything that came afterward. The wellness identity she quietly built across 2 decades didn't disappear once her acting career wound down. It finally had room to fully exist, no longer competing with 12-hour filming days and press tours that left no space for much of anything else. Her return to acting in 2024 doesn't contradict any of that. If anything, it confirms it. She came back only once she had built a life stable and balanced enough to make that choice freely, rather than out of obligation or necessity, for a project she genuinely wanted to be part of. Cameron Diaz didn't abandon Hollywood out of bitterness, and she didn't get quietly pushed out the way the early rumors suggested. She simply outgrew the version of herself that needed the industry to feel complete, and only returned once stepping back into that world meant something entirely different than it once did. That's really the core of the whole story, both why she left when she did and why she eventually felt ready to come back on her own terms. Cameron Diaz spent roughly 20 years quietly building an identity the cameras never fully captured, and then walked away from Hollywood at the exact moment the industry expected her to want it most. Her comeback, rather than undercutting that decision, actually reinforces how much she got right by stepping away when she did. She didn't return because retirement failed her. She returned because her life had finally reached a point where acting could exist as something she chose, rather than something she was required to do. There is also a part of this story that gets overlooked simply because it happened so gradually that no single headline ever captured it properly. Most celebrity exits get framed around one moment, a press release, a tearful interview, a sudden cancellation of upcoming projects. Diaz's exit didn't work that way at all. It unfolded across roughly 4 quiet years between her final film in 2014 and her first real public confirmation in 2018, with almost nothing happening in between that journalists could point to as evidence of a plan. That gap is actually one of the more telling details in the whole story. If she had been pushed out by the industry, there would likely have been some sign of friction along the way, a cancelled deal, a public dispute, a quote suggesting she was no longer wanted. None of that ever surfaced. Instead, what happened was closer to a slow withdrawal. Role offers simply stopped being accepted, and public appearances became less frequent, until eventually there were no new films left to point to at all. It's worth sitting with just how unusual that timeline is inside an industry built almost entirely around visibility. Hollywood rewards constant presence. Staying relevant typically means staying seen, taking meetings, doing press, showing up at award shows whether or not a project is currently being promoted. Diaz essentially opted out of all of that machinery while she was still one of the most bankable names in the business, which is part of why so many fans assumed something must have gone wrong behind the scenes. The far less dramatic truth, based on everything she has said publicly since, is that nothing went wrong at all. She simply decided the trade-off was no longer worth it for her personally, regardless of how it looked from the outside. It's also worth pointing out how consistent her explanation has remained across very different settings and audiences. She has discussed it on a wellness-focused interview series with a close friend, in a separate sit-down with a television host known for a more comedic interview style, in a business-oriented appearance at a summit focused on professional women, and in conversations with mainstream news outlets covering her retirement directly. Across all of those formats, the substance barely shifted. She talks about the grind of the schedule, about handing pieces of her life over to other people for years, about reaching a point in her early 40s where she wanted to take that control back. The fact that the story holds together this consistently across so many separate interviews, given years apart, lends a fair amount of credibility to the idea that this really was a personal decision rather than a carefully managed narrative built to cover for something else. There's also a financial angle worth mentioning, since it tends to come up whenever a wealthy celebrity claims they walked away from money. By the time she stepped back, Diaz had spent 2 decades as one of the highest-paid actresses in the industry, meaning the decision came from genuine financial security rather than desperation. That removes the explanation some reach for when a celebrity disappears, the idea that they were forced out due to lack of opportunities. Diaz wasn't struggling to get cast. She simply no longer wanted the kind of life that came with staying in constant demand. None of this means the path away from Hollywood was easy simply because it was voluntary. Stepping back from an identity built over 20 years, tied to an entire support system built around keeping her career running, is its own kind of difficult transition. She has spoken about needing to relearn how to manage parts of her life that other people had handled for so long that she had lost the habit of doing it herself. What makes her story useful as a case study is how clearly it illustrates the gap between how a career looks from the outside and how it feels to live inside it. From the outside, her career in the early 2010s looked like the kind of success most people in entertainment spend their lives chasing and never reach. From the inside, by her own account, it looked more like a life where almost nothing belonged to her personally anymore, where even basic daily decisions had been outsourced for so long that reclaiming them felt like starting over. That gap between perception and experience shows up whenever celebrities eventually speak honestly about stepping away from fame, but it's rarely discussed with this much detail. Diaz didn't frame her decision as a complaint about Hollywood specifically. She has never suggested the industry treated her unfairly or pushed her out the way some peers have described. Her framing has stayed focused on her own choices and her own need for change, which is part of why the story reads less like an industry expose and more like a personal account of someone